Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's edition of Entrepreneurship to the Point. Very topical topic that we'll be discussing this evening. How will compulsory vaccinations impact on small businesses? In last week, Discovery, one of our largest healthcare companies in South Africa, announced that they will be making vaccinations compulsory to its employee base and some of its service providers that work on their sites. And this will be coming in effect from the 1st of January 2022. And this evening, we want to unpack some of the implications of that specifically towards small business. Once again, I'm Sean Tiernissen. I'll be facilitating the discussion this evening. And my guest is Dr. Ron Whelan from Discovery Holdings and Abdul Bacchus from Bacchus Attorneys. We would definitely want to hear from you. So please do use the chat facility to ask some questions. We're also streaming live from YouTube, and the recording will be available on our Entrepreneurship to the Point YouTube channel. So please do let us know who you are, where you're joining from, and how you would like to be part of the discussion this evening. To get the jab or not to get the jab, that is the question. As I said, last week, Discovery announced that vaccinations will become compulsory to all its staff and service providers. There's been a lot of talk in the marketplace about the ethics of compulsory vaccinations. When our president announced the fact that we would be going through the vaccination rollout, it was said that it would be something that would be of a choice that we would be able to make. But what happens to you as a small business if you are a service provider to a big business that has made or that will be making the vaccinations compulsory? Let's have the conversation and let's find out what are some of these considerations that is taking place in the marketplace. Once again, use the chat facility below to let us know what your thoughts are, where you're dialing in, and be part of the conversation. Dr. Ron Whelan, welcome this evening and good evening. Last week, we saw Discovery making the big announcement and really one of the first of big business in South Africa to do so and get this and to make the vaccinations compulsory. Talk us through that process organizationally, and also the move towards making it as publicly available as possible.
Well, thank you for hosting us, Sean. Much appreciated. Great to be with you today. And, good day to your guests on the webinar. I hope it's going to be helpful. It's been an extensive debate and very deliberate debate on the Discovery front, something we haven't taken lightly, and we've done extensive work over the last few months in developing this position. I think at the outset, it's important to speak a little bit about why we've decided to go in this direction as an organization, and it's really driven by three underlying reasons. The first reason is that we're sitting on an unprecedented public health tragedy in South Africa. And I know we've all become somewhat accustomed in some way to the pandemic over the last 18 months or so. But the reality is we've seen just short of 250,000 excess deaths in South Africa over the last 18 months. That means that we've seen 250,000 more people die in the last 18 months compared to similar periods previously. And that's certainly a catastrophe. Across the Discovery base, we've seen over 14,000 of our clients die across our Discovery Health business and our life insurance business. And having just started to see the end of the third wave, I think we felt a compelling need to act and act boldly. I think the second reason for our decision to go in this direction is that the evidence is conclusive, both globally and in South Africa now, that vaccines are safe and effective. So we knew that there was good evidence globally. You'll know that there's been over 6 billion vaccination doses delivered globally to date, with extremely low side effect profiles and extremely low adverse events. We're now, as Discovery Health, have got significant data on vaccine safety and efficacy across South Africa as well. So We've analyzed both the J&J data as well as the Pfizer data, bearing in mind that there's been 1.9 million vaccination doses delivered across Discovery Health. So we have a big data set now in Discovery. And indeed, across Discovery vaccination sites, we delivered 600,000 vaccinations. So looking at that data, we've got conclusive evidence that the vaccines are working, both at reducing infection as well as severe disease. In fact, it reduces your infection risk by anywhere between 50 and 80%, and it reduces your risk of death and disease and death by 80 to 95%. So big reductions. The third reason, and probably the most important reason internally for us, is we feel like we've got a strong social and moral obligation to not only protect our employees, but also to protect all those people who come into our different sites. And that includes suppliers, it includes tenants across our offices, it obviously includes our employees, it includes visitors, it includes customers. And we really feel strongly about this. Our core purpose is to make people healthier and to enhance and protect their lives. So that's our moral obligation and our values obligation. In addition to that, we actually have a legal obligation. I think this is quite an important point for small employers as well. In terms of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, you're required to provide a safe workplace for all of your employees and do everything possible to protect your employees from harm. Within the Occupational Health and Safety Act, there's a specific reference to hazardous biological agents and protecting employees from hazardous biological agents. And the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the virus that causes COVID-19, is a biological agent. It's a virus, and it spreads through respiratory droplets, and this is what we've been fighting over the last 18 months. And there is provision in the Occupational Health and Safety Act around that. And you'll realize as part of the Disaster Management Act as well, we've had to do everything to protect employees, whether it's mask wearing, hand sanitization, social distancing, and work from home, and so on and so forth. So those really are underlying reasons for the implementation. Insofar as in what it means for our employees and our suppliers is effective 1 January, Discovery offices and sites will become vaccinated-only zones. So you'll need evidence that you've been vaccinated to enter any one of our office buildings or any one of our Discovery stores, and so on and so forth. As part of that process, and this is a very important point, there will be an exceptions and appeals and exception process. So we recognize that there will be certain individuals who have very valid reasons for not being vaccinated, whether they health reasons or religious reasons or cultural reasons and other reasons. So we have within our policy made provision for appeals and exceptions on the grounds of very valid reasons. We'll also provide for reasonable accommodations. What reasonable accommodations means, there may be another alternative to prove that you're not infected with COVID-19. For example, a recent COVID-19 test, a PCR test or an antigen test. So in as much as it'll be a firm policy, there will be some exceptions to that policy that will apply equally to employees as well as suppliers.
And Dr. Whelan, in terms of the fact that we know that the policy is something that's only going to come into effect from next year, and it's still a working document. But I guess if I'm a small business providing a service to Discovery, what's some of the thinking at this stage in terms of how would this be implemented? How would it be monitored? And how would I need to almost cascade this responsibility down to my employees within that small business? So if I'm a cleaning company, cleaning the Discovery head office, what's the level of monitoring that will be taking place to ensure that that is cascaded?
Well, I think a few points to make on this. Firstly, we have a number of small business partners, and we're very proud of our small business partners. We like working with small businesses, and as part of that, we certainly want to work collaboratively with your small business partners in helping you figure out this policy. I think the second thing is that I would hope that many small businesses are adopting similar stances, and I'm not advocating for mandatory vaccination policies. That really is an individual business decision. But I think in the essence of assisting South Africa get back to normal, it's good for the economy. In the essence of protecting communities and protecting employees, I would love to believe that small businesses are right on the front line in increasing vaccination uptake across their employees, regardless of what Discovery has done or any other big corporate has done. I think you would acknowledge that it's the right thing to do. And then I think thirdly, in terms of the implementation, I think there will be many tools available to validate vaccination status. So Discovery has a digital vaccination card. Obviously, when you get vaccinated, you get a paper-based card as proof of and evidence of your vaccination. The National Department of Health is developing a digital card at the moment. So we believe by the time January rolls around, there will be many ways to validate whether vaccination has happened. And against the backdrop of free and readily accessible vaccination in South Africa, there really are no barriers to getting vaccinated. It just requires some work from all of us, big business, small business, leaders across South Africa to promote uptake of vaccination. But we certainly are committed to working alongside our small business partners in implementing this policy, streamlining the operational requirements around this. This really shouldn't be a barrier to accessing our buildings and to working alongside us. And we're certainly looking to proactively engage.
Yeah, and I guess you've mentioned the fact that there's provisions made in the Occupational Health and Safety Act to ensure that we create workspaces that are safe. But we also see the whole debate globally around the freedom of choice and the constitutionality that individuals will have to be able to choose whether or not to be vaccinated or not. What's the balance in the debate between the constitutional rights of an individual versus that is prescribed in the Occupational Health and Safety Act in creating safe workplaces?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think the first thing is I'm not the lawyer, and I'm by no means a legal expert on this. I'm a medical doctor by training and spent my career in corporate healthcare. And I think it's probably best for Abdul to weigh in on this. He's really the expert around this. What we have done as Discovery is we've engaged extensively across the legal fraternity, labor law, occupational health and safety law, constitutional elements around this. We've got a lot of your constitutional input. And I think what we're seeing from this is South Africa has a very strong constitution, which is brilliant and protects the rights of all individuals across South Africa. And that's an important point, in that the rights of everyone is protected. That includes people who are vaccinated and unvaccinated. And I think what's been interesting around our implementation of the policy is the pouring out of people who've been vaccinated are extremely anxious around COVID and the relief that they now potentially have access to an even safer workplace. So you've got to balance the rights of all individuals in weighing up this policy. And then, of course, organizations and businesses also have rights. So when we think about rights, it's all employees, all people, plus businesses, and we've got to balance those very gently and delicately. And then I think the second point that we've learned through our legal experts throughout this process is that rights are not absolute. So there are instances where rights can be curtailed to a greater or lesser degree. And when one thinks about the pandemic, all of our rights have been constrained in terms of curfews, and mask wearing, travel restrictions, and so on and so forth. So there are some times where the rights of individuals are curtailed in the interests of the broader public or the broader community interest. But I think what's really important to point out there, Sean, is our process is designed to unearth all of these exceptions and rights as part of the process. So our employees are We have a full appeals and exception process that we've designed that takes cognizance of the full set of employee rights, whether those are religious beliefs, cultural beliefs, health-related rights. We'll put those into a melting pot. We consider those carefully. And then what we also have is a reasonable accommodations process. So if we're not able, if your people, are, for whatever reason, are not able to be vaccinated, we'll embark on a reasonable accommodations process that will look at specific alternatives.
Awesome. I think that just gives us a segue to kind of move into some of the legal aspects. But I see we do have a hand up on the from our attendees. If they're able to use the chat facility to be able to pose the question, and we'll pose those questions through to the panel. Abdul, you an attorney by profession, and I guess part of the big consideration around this decision, as Dr. Whelan has said, was making sure that it is within the ambit of the law and consultation across the various spheres of the law, you know, both from a health and safety perspective, from a labor perspective, and then also from a constitutional rights perspective. Can you give us an unpack some of the kind of legal considerations that you would or that a small business would have to make within this decision-making process?
Thank you, Sean. Good evening to you, and good evening to the doctor and our participants. I think at the outset, I'd just like to give a brief overview of where the law stands on this point. And the reality is these are uncharted waters. Where we are right now is something very new, something novel, and there isn't a precedent to fall back on.
Abdul, you can continue.
Okay. In law, you always hear of legal precedent, where they speak about the cases that have been decided, the decisions of the higher courts, decision of the Constitutional Court. So in this stage, there's still going to be litigation around it. But from a start point, the Bill of Rights in our Constitution is considered the cornerstone of democracy. And within this Bill of Rights is enshrined the right to bodily integrity, the right to freedom of choice and religion. These are your sections 12 and 15 within the Constitution. But these rights are not absolute. And these rights may be curtailed in layman's terms for the better good of the greater community. And an example of this is where you look at the regulations in terms of the Department of Labor, which has come out in terms of the consolidated directions. Now, there's always been an obligation on every employer to create a safe working environment and a healthy working environment. Towards the middle of this year, there was a direction that came out which specified that in conjunction with providing a safe work environment, the current scenario needs to be dealt with in relation to COVID. And every workplace has to apply a system where they go out and do some kind of an analysis and decide if it's necessary for them to implement vaccinations as a mandatory process. Then there's a further onerous duty that's placed on employers who employ more than 50 employees to report regularly on what they are doing in their workplaces to the relevant departments. Now, smaller businesses who are employing below 10 employees would have to consider the age of their employees, social distancing, wearing of masks, and the duty is on everyone. But on the ground, for some reason, recently, the word has been now Discovery and the others are these big companies that are bullying individuals into taking the vaccine, which is not the case. It is actually required by law that every employer within the Republic comply with this. And the direction was issued in line with the regulations relating to disaster management. So from that standpoint, if an employer is unable to somehow accommodate an employee by allowing them to work from home, by allowing them to carry out services from elsewhere remotely. And they feel that it's necessary and a requirement for their workforce to be vaccinated, then that is lawful and valid right now. Down the line, certainly there may be litigation around it. There's going to be a lot of questions around it. But the reality also is that it's a global trend. If you look at from last week up to now, I think in America also a lot of restaurants have started making it mandatory for even the patrons who attend the restaurants to be vaccinated. So everyone is moving towards a trend where there is a larger and a greater move towards people being vaccinated, employees being vaccinated, and creating the safe environment. Now, smaller employees also have a duty to ensure that they're creating a safe working environment. And what they should start doing right now is considering if they require employees to be vaccinated, what their reasoning is, and how they can accommodate employees who are unwilling or unable to take the vaccination. There's a number of medical issues that have been raised by certain employees in the field that I'm in, and those are to be considered. So when it comes to workspaces, I've seen workspaces where individuals are set up in a little office within the greater building, but that's completely separate and isolated, for want of a better word. So that would be a manner in which they are accommodating that employee who is for medical reasons unable to take the vaccination. When it comes to service providers, generally the difficulty is going to be that a service provider 9 out of 10 times has employees who go out to physically provide a service. It's very seldom that it's something that's done remotely. And in that instance, if there is an existing agreement, the parties will then have to have some kind of rapport and decide if they are going to vary the terms of their agreement to make it compulsory for the service providers' employees to be vaccinated to attend on site, or if they are going to find an alternative way of dealing with the service that has to be provided, or ultimately if they feel that both parties then should be released from their duties in terms of the agreement. However, if you are getting into an agreement as a small business or an undertaking going forward, then the duty is going to be placed on you to make sure when you are contracting with any company that you clarify if there is a requirement in relation to your service that you're going to provide around vaccination, around your employees entering sites, entering premises, that they will have to be vaccinated. Because if any business or any individual enters into a contract and they accept that term within the contract, the term in law is agreement. So there was a consensus and there was agreement. You have agreed to that. You cannot then turn around and breach the agreement based on your employees not being able to vaccinate or not wanting to vaccinate. That will then be a pitfall which the contracting party would have to deal with.
So I think what I'm hearing is very much the fact that the challenge is going to come in for existing service providers that do have contracts in place and being able to then adopt to this new reality, although it's been written into the ambit of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Almost the question that I'm weighing up is, does the Occupational Health and Safety Act in this case trump the Constitution and the constitutional rights? Where's once again the question that I asked Dr. Whelan was, where's the balance in these two considerations? And I think what I am happy with is the fact that with re-engaging or with new contracts going out to small businesses, if the terms of the contract is that you would have to be vaccinated to be on site, it's a choice that the organization is going to have to put in place in order to take up that opportunity. But Abdul, maybe just weigh in between this balance between Occupational Health and Safety Act and the constitutional right of choice. Where do we see it? I mean, we're seeing the riots globally around anti-vaxxers, if we may call them that, speaking about their rights. What's your thoughts on it?
Yes, Sean, the Constitution is the highest law in the land. as is always referred to. And it's not automatically trumped by any legislation that comes out. So if you look at the legislation and you look at the directive that's out there, it's not a mandatory vaccination across the board for every employee. There is an assessment that is done, and the assessment is of the workplace. And within that workplace, if the employer feels that he is unable to accommodate employees, or it is necessary to safeguard the employees within that workplace by vaccination, then that employer would make it mandatory for the employees to vaccinate. However, that being said, as I pointed out initially, I do foresee litigation around this point, in that we have these regulations, we have the reality of the pandemic, as you correctly point out, throughout the world, and weighing that up against the South African Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the rights of these employees. Where do we stand? So that litigation will certainly ensue in future and probably then answer a lot of the questions. But as I say, right now, it is not that every employer must direct employees to take the vaccination. It is a choice, and it is something that is done based on a calculated assessment.
So, Dr. Whelan, maybe we want to be able to provide some sort of a guideline or inputs to small businesses that are listening to this webinar. As a big business, you've made various considerations in making this decision. What advice, in terms of the process that you went through as Discovery Holdings, if we had to cascade some of that advice down to small businesses, what advice would you give them?
Well, I think it would follow a similar process to what we followed, and there needs to be a strong reason and motivation to move in this direction. So I think, as I described before, we feel a strong moral and social obligation to move in this direction, and that's come through lots of debate and lots of discussion across various structures within Discovery. And I would say, as a small business, it's a question of you're contemplating where you stand on these issues, morally, socially, legally, and forming the backbone of your direction around this. If you've got conviction, and if your leadership team is aligned, and if your organization is aligned, these things become easier to move forward. It's when there's a bit of swaying either way that these things become, I think, quite a lot harder to do. And I think that conviction for us, as I mentioned earlier on, comes from a strong point in that we are really sitting with a public health crisis here. We're sitting with a very effective mechanism that has been proven safe, that we can advocate against, and a strong commitment to keeping our staff and our employees safe. And I think that in many ways, those principles apply to small businesses as well. We all have a contribution to make in terms of getting out of this pandemic. We know the impact it's had from a health perspective. We know the impact it's had from an economic perspective. I think we certainly are happy to help any small businesses with the data and the evidence around the vaccines. And then I think most small businesses, in fact, I think small businesses do an amazing job of keeping their employees safe and doing everything to protect their employees. And we've seen that through the pandemic. I mean, the extent to which small businesses have protected their employees through lockdown restrictions has been incredible. And I expect small businesses will do something similar in this regard. And I think it's worth weighing up is that the landscape overall, as Abdul mentioned, is moving towards requirement around vaccination. So it's not only workplaces, it's sports events and concerts and public spaces. An interesting anecdote for you. I'm an avid trail runner, and I've entered a trail running event in September. And as part of the trail running event, the event organizer said in the email, this year we'll let you in if you're unvaccinated, but we're just letting you know next year the event is a vaccinated only event. And I think we're going to see that play out in conferences. I think we're going to see that play out. So this is not only, I would say, a supplier involvement. This is really, I think we're going to see quite a big societal movement in this direction. which is good for South Africa because we need to get through the pandemic, and we certainly need to avert the fourth wave in our view.
And I think so. If we weigh in on some of the questions, we just had a poll to ask, are we, in terms of the listeners that's on at the moment, are you mandating your staff to get vaccinated? And 50% of those that answered said, no, they're not mandating, but encouraging. And in the chat, we have Trifina from CEO of Triumphant Zoe that said that part of it was being able to provide the right level of information to their staff members in order to say where are sites that they can go get vaccinated, what's the registration process, and leave it up to the staff, which in essence, if we're able to get, I guess the challenge that we're finding is that the word mandatory or compulsory almost makes things forced versus encouraging and providing the correct information to people in order for them to be able to make that choice. Are we going to win the debate around it? I guess is the question from a long-term perspective. Is it? We know human nature is that anything that's forced upon us doesn't necessarily get received well. Is it the right move to make it compulsory, or should we have encouraged? I think we saw Dr. Whelan, we saw Tiger Brands saying, using the words in a voluntary vaccination campaign that they're implementing on their sites. Where does the balance come in between the word kind of compulsory versus informing and allowing freedom of choice? Are we seeing people are not taking it up because of lack of information?
So I think it's all of the things you've just mentioned, and you're spot on. So it's the team that's on the call is spot on. It's a question of providing the right information, a question of providing the right motivation, a question of providing the right access. And we've certainly at Discovery have provided all of those levers and intent on providing all of those levers now over the next 3 to 4 months as we move into mandatory vaccination world. And I must be honest with you, Sean, I'm quietly confident and optimistic that by December, we are going to have almost all of our staff vaccinated and that the policy will likely be moot. That would be the best place to be, and that we don't need a policy come January. And we certainly are seeing Discovery employees mobilize in that direction as well. And we're seeing pockets of leadership mobilize in that direction. So I'm quite excited about that. And that entails all of the levers you've spoken about, motivation and enabling vaccination. I think employers, also small businesses as well, play a role in giving employees time off work, providing access to transport to vaccination sites. These vaccination sites are all now on a walk-in basis. Vaccines are entirely free of charge. So that really the barriers to entry for vaccination have gone away. I think it's also important to consider the flip side of the coin, Sean. And you can imagine a world, we've already started to see this play out in employees on the other side saying, I'm only going to come to that training event if I'm confident that everyone else there is vaccinated. Or I'm only coming to this conference if everyone else is vaccinated. Or I'm only coming into the office if everyone is vaccinated. So if you play the flip side of the coin, you sit with an equally challenging problem to face if you don't have everyone vaccinated. So I think we'll see quite a lot of that play out forward. But we're confident that people are going to rise up. A lot of our folks just, the response was interesting. It was overwhelmingly positive. A lot of relief from a lot of employees. There were some people who are still hesitant and just wanted to know, well, how's this going to work? How do I make this decision? So they were thirsty and hungry for information. And then there was a resistant camp, and we'll certainly work with the resistant camp. I could tell you the resistant camp was less than 2% of our employees are saying we're stuck in this corner, and we'll work with them around understanding why they're there, understanding their rights, looking for reasonable accommodation. So this is just, I guess, it's a nudge in a direction that we think is right for everyone.
Okay, awesome. And then Abdul, advice for small businesses from a practical legal perspective, if they needed to go ahead and implement or make the reasonable accommodation to ensure that their staff are vaccinated, how do they practically go about it if their staff members are, in the case of, for instance, Discovery, it was a 2%, which is quite a low number, that was not necessarily keen on the vaccinations. But if you're in a small business with a small employee base, and sentiments are that they're not keen to take up the vaccinations, how do you navigate through this uncharted territory?
Sean, in terms of the legislation, your small business is described as a business that employs less than 10 employees. Now, while this applies across the board, for a small business, they have set out that social distancing, sanitizing, proper ventilation, and the norm that we've been seeing right now in relation to creating a safe working environment remains. But the small business is also duty bound in terms of the regulation to ensure that they do an assessment within that workplace, even though they employ 5, 6, 8, or 10 employees, to decide if it is necessary for them to either accommodate employees or for employees to then go out and be vaccinated. But what must be borne in mind is that the legislation specifies that the rights in terms of the Constitution should also be considered, as well as collective agreements, which is generally agreements with trade unions and other organizations where there was collective bargaining. But for the smaller business, what I suggest, if they haven't by now, which they should have, there needs to be an assessment, a risk assessment within the work environment. And it needs to be established. And unfortunately, age has come in here. In terms of the Constitution, you don't discriminate anyone in terms of age. But that, again, is for the greater good and for the individual good, where they say employees who are over the age of 60, you consider them first, that, are they at a higher risk coming into the workplace? Can we accommodate them differently? So that risk assessment needs to be done. And you need to establish how you can accommodate employees in the workplace if it's possible for most of them to work remotely. However, if you are based or carrying out services in a sector where it's impossible for your employees to work remotely, you'll then have to take the necessary steps to decide what will be appropriate in the workplace. And for those that are unwilling to vaccinate, if there is a manner in which you can accommodate them, for example, on site as opposed to going out. And the question that still remains to be answered is whether an employer can now dismiss an employee based on their refusal to take a vaccine. So that's certainly something that will play out in future if it does reach that state. But first thing they need to do is make sure they do their assessment and decide what is reasonable and what is necessary. Then, if there's an existing contract, 99% of every written contract out there will have a clause that allows for variation, but the variation must be done in writing. So if there is an existing contract as a service provider where a small business is providing a service, in that instance, they should then proceed to negotiate and try and amend, if necessary, that service provider agreement to conform with the current norms and what their risk assessment has shown them. Sean, I think 15:45. I think Doc wants to.
Yeah, I think Dr. Whelan, I know you have to go off, so I'm going to give you a quick minute just to potentially respond. We've got a question in the chat, and it says specifically addressed to you, Dr. Ron. Vaccines have historically taken 5 to 10 years and longer to be approved for human use following extensive trials and testing. Can Discovery guarantee that these vaccines will have no serious long-term effects in light of the fact that there are no long-term studies. I guess the medical aspect of the vaccines is not something that we touched on this evening, but in a quick 30 seconds response, comment on that question.
Geez, that's a big question to answer in 30 seconds.
Take as long as you want. I know you've got some time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. It's a very good question and a very good observation. I think the reality around this is that all of the vaccines are built on existing technology. That's the first point to make. So the adenovirus vector vaccine technology has been around for decades, over 50 years, in fact. The mRNA technology has been around for over 20 years. So the technology has been in evolution. So we have long-term studies on that underlying technology around the vaccine. So it's not entirely true to say we don't have longitudinal evidence around the vaccines. I think the second point to make is that there've been no shortcuts taken in the vaccine development. So each one of the vaccines has gone through all of the trial processes that any other vaccine globally over history has had to go through. And I can tell you these trial processes are rigorous. They go through multiple phases of trials. They extend to many thousands of individuals. Most of the vaccine trials have gone into 30, 40, 50,000 people that have been studied as part of these trials. And I mean, we're talking about the leading scientists and the leading companies globally. I think it's also important at that juncture to say, when you compare the rigor of vaccine and pharmaceutical trialing to the food industry, for example, and the things we consume on a day-to-day basis, we'll happily drop in to any given restaurant, or any given fast food outlet without asking any questions around, well, what's the research on this? How long did it take to develop? What's in it? How do you know that there's no long-term side effects? So I think it's quite interesting how the vaccines almost are measured against a different bar. And then finally, I think worth mentioning, as I mentioned earlier on, we've now seen over 6 billion doses of vaccines delivered globally, every single dose under scrutiny. So this is probably the biggest effort on electronic health records globally that we've ever seen. We've monitored the outcomes, we've monitored the side effects. We've seen this now over the last almost a year that we're running against vaccines. And I think that gives us a lot of confidence. That's not to say that they're not side effects. There are side effects around vaccines, as with any other medicine. Fortunately, the side effects are very small. So we're talking 2% side effects out of the Sasonke trial. Of those 2% of people that had side effects, 1.6% of them were mild and moderate side effects. So localized pain and inflammation, a little bit of fever and rigors, typical that you would get with vaccination. So I don't want to underplay the point that, of course, there are side effects. These are not absolute, but certainly when you weigh up the risks and the benefits, these vaccines, in our view, are very safe and very effective, and will certainly help us save lives going forward and keep our workplaces safe.
Thank you so much, Dr. Whelan, for joining us this evening. And I know you have to go, so I'm going to let you go as we just conclude the discussion around compulsory vaccinations and how it's going to impact small businesses. I think the last point as you sign out, Dr. Whelan, is that making sure, please consult small businesses, consult your suppliers, educate them as well, and engage them in this process, because sometimes the impact to small businesses is not necessarily always considered. And hopefully, as we unroll and unpack this, we can ensure that we are effectively assisting small businesses to navigate this new normal.
Yeah, I want to put out a firm commitment there from Discovery's part. As I said, we're friends of small businesses. We like working with small businesses. We certainly are fully supportive. The other thing I'd like to make available to everyone on this call is we have a Discovery COVID-19 website that we update on a daily basis with tools and information around vaccines, around COVID. please feel free to download information for your employees across that website. It comes from our clinical excellence team, and we aim to, there's a range of tools available there. We've had that from the beginning of COVID, freely accessible. Please feel free to use that if it's helpful.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you for hosting me. Appreciate it.
Pleasure. And as we conclude, if there's no other questions from the chats, as we conclude the discussion this evening, I like the perspective that we have from Lungelo Buthelezi saying, what I've seen with some big companies is that they invest a lot in the education around the vaccinations, which makes it easier for employees to buy into something that they have when they have full knowledge about it. So education is key and critical. We also have the resource available from Discovery for you guys. So if you go to the chat facility, you can click on the link for the website. As we navigate through this new normal, we understand that COVID has had a huge impact on small businesses. The debate around the vaccines is going to have another impact on small businesses. And as we unravel these challenges, our aim at Entrepreneurship to the Point is to bring you the information to be able to have the discussion. And please do visit our website for any additional resources. We'll also make available elements from the Health and Safety Act as we discussed it this evening to participants that were on the call. And I guess we are, as we started the call, saying we are in uncharted waters. Please do engage with us as we chart this course together to provide the necessary information to support small businesses in making sure that you are able to sustain your business. On the screen as well, we want to invite you to our next session, which is on the 28th of September, and it's unpacking the Continental Free Trade Agreement for small businesses. And once again, all these things will have a ripple effect in terms of how COVID has impacted trade and trade across borders as well. But we will unpack the Continental Free Trade Agreement on our next webinar. So thank you once again so much for joining us. Thank you, Abdul, for your insights, and in absence, Dr. Whelan, for your insights. Hopefully we've unpacked and provided a little bit more insight in terms of the vaccination rollout and compulsory vaccinations that's coming through from big business. But really, ultimately, as a small business, you're going to need to make some decisions as to how it will impact your business. So have a good evening, everyone, and be safe. Thank you.